Very interesting to see, this view from a retailer and looking at how retailers are also starting to address some of these complex issues around biodiversity. Are there any questions to this presentation? Yes?
Matt Smith, Joint Nature Conservation Committee in the UK. Firstly, thanks to all the panellists for excellent presentations. My question is to Kirsten. Obviously, Woolworths have set themselves for very commendable targets, and that's great. And obviously, you're showing some excellent success. I suppose two questions. Firstly, how is it you go about actually auditing your various projects to get the statistics you've used up here? But also, how far do you go to actually future-proof a lot of these schemes? Because the percentages you gave to do with production in South Africa were pretty stark. So I was wondering how you take in the kind of projected future global changes in your programs.
Are you referring to the Farming for the Future stats?
Yes.
Okay. In terms of how we measure the outcomes from that program, it's all independently done by an environmental consultancy who actually helped to develop the scheme, or the program, should I say. So we ensure that the farmers are, it's all independent, and the basis of the scheme is essentially that the farmers are provided with first of all, a report following audits, and they are required to show improvement at each successive audit. In terms of the stats that you saw, that was near the beginning of the implementation of Farming for the Future. We haven't run a study like that since, simply because of resources, but that was also done on an independent basis. And but it's clear that those statistics are likely to be that was the beginning. Going forward, you're unlikely to see the same incremental sort of improvements. But the point is that we do expect there to be a continual improvement in the scores that farmers are achieving. Does that answer your question? Can you remind me?
So I was saying you were talking about water scarcity and the percentage of... Sorry, the second part of my question, just to follow up, was how do you future-proof the programme? So you were saying that water scarcity and available land is lacking in South Africa. It's likely that this will get worse as climate shifts, climate changes. How do you go around future-proofing the management plans that you give to your growers, for example?
Well, as part of the Farming for the Future scheme, it's built into the program that part of the review process is this type of farming sustainable in this area? And quite often we found that it may not be. So we take the advisory role then in terms of what would be a suitable alternative crop that you could grow instead. A nice example of the water stewardship pilot is a good example of the direction that we ultimately want to be moving into with our suppliers, water being obviously a critical issue for us, and something that we are planning to extend with one new water stewardship approach each year now till 2020. So that's where we see our critical role in terms of future-proofing our business, because water is probably our largest risk factor.
Rick? Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question for both Kirsten and Jan Kees, because the presentations you're making, I mean, you're showing very positive examples, and you make it sound very easy. But we know that once you start talking to your suppliers, there's a lot of pushback often from suppliers. Producers that are saying, oh, yet another requirement. So in this process, how, you've given the example of Knorr, the Knorr Fund, but in this example, how many suppliers are jumping ship? And how many, and how can you get them on board? We saw the little questionnaire, like business needs to drive business compliance, but it's not necessarily that easy. So what is the feedback from your suppliers on those actions?
Me to go first? There is pushback from suppliers, just like we push back on all kinds of initiatives to start separate reporting on this, that, and the other. We're all pressed for resources, and so it is natural. But the point is, for farmers and suppliers, there is value in participating in the program. We organize supplier summits together with Knorr, with the brand. We did one in Belgium a couple of weeks ago where we had probably 160 people, maybe 60 from Unilever and 100 from a large group of suppliers. This was with a supplier called Ardo in Belgium. They are probably the largest quick frozen vegetable supplier in Europe. And they had invited and they allowed competitors to come to participate in the workshop, actually go into their factory, talk with the farmers. And we brought other suppliers, Unilever suppliers from all over the world, from India, from South Africa, from Latin America, to that summit. There is a lot of value for farmers in talking with the people who manage the brand. Knorr as a brand employs 200 chefs who think of new recipes for Knorr, but basically give a lot of workshops, particularly to the catering industry, on how to use Knorr products. If you put a farmer and a chef in the same room, the discussion will be about sustainability within 5 minutes, because it is about the crop and how a healthy crop leads to better taste, and how better taste and healthiness refers to consumers, etc. There's very little you need to do. Put a video camera in there, check the Knorr website. We have tons of these kind of videos. And they really value that. They really value the fact that they now know what happens to their onions. I was really surprised to find a friend of mine who now works for South Platform was in a coffee workshop in Uganda probably 6-7 years ago, and he talked with the coffee farmers there, and they said to him, we don't know what white people do with those beans, because they didn't know coffee. They had never roasted coffee themselves, they didn't drink it, and they didn't know the supply chain. And the same is true for onion farmers in Europe. They didn't know until a couple of years ago what happened, and there is real value, and they take pride. Look at the interviews with farmers on the Knorr website, you can see it. You can see it in their faces. So there is pushback if what we ask from suppliers becomes unreasonable. But as long as you can show the business value that's in there for them and for their farmers, they're willing to do things. They really are. And I have to add that we're a pretty good customer.
I would very much echo that as well. Excuse me. We've seen in both the farming and also the processing side of things where we're asking for better performance, it's actually leading to more efficiency, cost savings, and other benefits for them. I think you have to. It has to be managed carefully. There has to be mutually beneficial aspects, and you can't fire a million questions at your suppliers and ask them and expect them to always comply. But I think in terms of where we're heading in sustainable farming, there's a definite case for being in a partnership.
Okay, well, thank you so much to all our panelists. I see that we're out of time. I had quite a bit of issues here on my list, but time is what we're in lack of in many cases. One last comment, maybe to think about and potentially address tomorrow, which I find sometimes always lacking in this discussion. So we talk about these good case studies and activities that are going on the ground, but at the same time we talk about challenges such as the lack of traceability, the complexity of measurement at the biodiversity at the ecosystem level. And one of the things which I was a bit surprised that didn't come out very strongly in the discussions today was, what about enforcement? I don't know how many of you have been, in looking at how all of these things that we're talking about are enforced. Just in the case of Indonesia, hundreds of islands talking about sustainable use. So what are the resources, what are the abilities to actually enforce many of the things that we're discussing about today outside these very specific, which are very good and very positive case studies? But again, biodiversity is being lost at alarming rates. And many times I think that it's not very clear on how this actually translates to feasible actions and enforcement at the field level. So with that, thank you very much for all of you that stayed throughout the day. I do have here a note that there are some announcements from the organizers.